Hi, my friends. Tonight we step back into a time you probably wouldn't want to visit, even in your wildest dreams. Imagine waking up one day and the world feels off. The sky is darker, the air colder, and everything around you quieter than it should be. This is not just a bad weather day, it's 536 CE a year, so strange and catastrophic that some historians call it the worst year to be alive. And trust me, you probably wouldn't last long. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Got a strange bit of history you want to hear before bed? Drop it in the comments. Wherever you are, I hope tonight brings you rest, comfort, and maybe a curious dream or two. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year 536 doesn't greet you with the gentle chirp of birds or the warm glow of dawn breaking over the horizon. Instead, the morning light struggles to pierce a dense gray haze. People in Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia report that the sun is barely visible, its glow reduced to a ghostly orb hanging in the sky weaker than the moon. It's as if the world is locked in an eternal twilight. Crops wither in the fields. Livestock huddle together for warmth, and an eerie silence fills the air. You trudge through a village in northern Europe where life is usually marked by the rhythm of seasons. But the villagers now face a harsh reality: the rhythm has stopped. The seasons are out of sync, and summer feels like the dead of winter. Temperatures have plummeted. Historians estimate that the global climate cooled by as much as Scudegraci, a drop significant enough to disrupt ecosystems, agriculture, and everyday survival. It's not just cold, it's apocalyptic. You pass a group of villagers huddled around a pitiful fire. Their faces are gaunt and their clothing is ragged. They've already burned through the winter stockpile and it's only June. One of them mutters about the sun being cursed. Another, older and frailer, says the gods are angry. You shiver, partly from the cold and partly from the weight of their despair. This isn't just happening in one place. Across the Mediterranean, scribes in Constantinople and Rome are writing about the sun giving no more light than the moon. In China, official records from the Wei dynasty describe a chilling scenario: crops failing, snow falling in midsummer, and famine sweeping through entire provinces. Imagine biting into the last bit of bread you'll see for weeks and knowing it has to keep your family alive. What caused this global darkness? That's the million-dollar question, or in this case, the million denarius question. Historians and scientists suspect a volcanic eruption so massive that it spewed ash high into the atmosphere, creating a veil that blocked sunlight for months or even years. Evidence points to a volcano in Iceland, or possibly Central America, as the culprit. Whichever one it would have unleashed enough ash and sulfur dioxide to change the course of history. Historians still argue whether the eruption was a singular event or part of a chain reaction of natural disasters. What we do know is that this wasn't the end. This darkness was only the prelude to a series of catastrophic events that would push humanity to its limits. As you wander through this shadowy world, you notice the effects of the darkness everywhere. The trees stand still, their leaves dull and lifeless. The rivers, usually teeming with fish, seem eerily calm, their surfaces reflecting the dim light of the veiled sun. Even the animals sense something is wrong. The usual chatter of birds is replaced by an unsettling quiet, broken only by the occasional caw of a crow. Imagine waking up each day and hoping for just a sliver of sunlight, only to be greeted by the same oppressive gloom. How do you even begin to rebuild when nature itself seems to have turned against you? In some places, people respond with a grim kind of ingenuity. In Scandinavia, farmers try to adapt by planting hardier crops, hoping they can withstand the cold. In the Mediterranean, communities turn to fishing, relying on the sea when the land fails them. But these efforts are like trying to patch a sinking ship. And then there are those who turn to the supernatural for answers. You see a crowd gathering in a small village square? A man dressed in tattered robes stands on a makeshift platform shouting about the end of days. His voice carries a mix of fear and fervor as he warns of divine punishment. The crowd listens, their faces a mix of hope and terror. Maybe they think if they offer the right sacrifice or say the right prayers, the sun will return and life will go back to normal. As night falls, the darkness becomes even more suffocating. You try to sleep, but the cold seeps into your bones. The wind howls like a restless spirit, and every shadow seems to flicker with hidden danger. You wonder if this is what the end of the world feels like, and yet despite everything people endure. It's a fragile, stubborn kind of survival, the kind that clings to life even when every sign points to its end. You see it in the mother who shares her last bit of bread with her child, in the farmer who sows seeds despite the failing harvests, and in the scribe who continues to record these strange, terrible days for future generations to read. The year 536 begins as a mystery, a challenge and a test of human resilience. And as you lie there trying to imagine the weight of it all, one thought lingers in your mind. What would you have done in their place? The eerie twilight of 536 doesn't let up as the days stretch into weeks, and weeks bleed into months. By now, you've settled into a grim routine. Each day is a fight for survival, and each night feels like an eternity under the cold, suffocating darkness. The villagers around you are beginning to crack under the pressure. Some hold on to hope, whispering prayers and offering small sacrifices to their gods. Others are slipping into despair, their eyes hollow and their voices tinged with fear. In the distance, you hear the faint ringing of a bell. You follow the sound, trudging through muddy paths until you reach a larger settlement, a town, or at least what's left of it. The marketplace, once bustling with life, is now nearly empty. A few desperate traders huddle in corners trying to sell dried fish, shriveled roots, and other scraps of food. A merchant approaches you holding out a handful of grain. This, he says, is the last of my stock. Take it or leave it. The price is absurd, more than you've ever paid for food, but you hand over your meager belongings anyway. Hunger has a way of making even the most frugal person reckless. As you wander the market, you notice something else, sickness. People are coughing, their faces pale and their movements sluggish. The poor sanitation of the time has turned this town into a breeding ground for disease. You try to keep your distance, but it's nearly impossible. The darkness, the cold, and the hunger are bad enough. But the arrival of disease feels like the final straw. Scholars later identify this time as the beginning of the Justinian plague, a pandemic that would sweep across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, killing millions. The disease, carried by fleas on rats, spreads quickly in the unsanitary conditions of medieval cities and villages. Historians still argue whether the plague began in 536 or slightly later, but its effects are undeniable. Imagine the symptoms: fever, chills, and swelling so severe that it feels like your body is betraying you. Without modern medicine, there's little anyone can do. Healers offer herbal remedies and priests pray for divine intervention, but the death toll rises with each passing day. In your small village, you watch as neighbors fall ill one by one. The air is thick with the smell of sickness, a pungent mix of sweat, decay, and desperation. Families light fires in their homes, hoping the smoke will purify the air and keep the disease at bay. Others burn incense, believing the sweet scent will ward off the plague. And yet there are moments of humanity amidst the chaos. You see a woman tending to her sick husband, her hands steady despite the fear in her eyes. A group of villagers gathers to dig graves for the dead, their shovels biting into the frozen earth. They work in silence, their breaths visible in the cold air. As the days grow darker, people begin to search for someone or something to blame. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some say the plague is punishment from the gods. Others whisper about witches and sorcery, accusing their neighbors of casting spells to bring about this curse. In one corner of the village, you see a group of men confronting an old woman. Her hunched frame and gnarled hands make her an easy target for their fear and anger. They accuse her of witchcraft, claiming she's responsible for the sickness and the failing crops. She denies it, her voice shaking, but the mob is relentless. You want to intervene, but you hesitate. What can you do against a crowd fueled by fear and desperation? Before you can decide, the men drag her away, their voices echoing with threats. You turn away, your stomach churning. Despite the darkness, life goes on. People adapt in strange and unexpected ways. In some areas, communities grow closer, banding together to share resources and protect one another. In others, the opposite happens. Neighbors turn on each other and trust becomes a luxury few can afford. As you walk through the village, you overhear a conversation between two farmers. They're discussing the strange weather patterns and the possibility that the gods are trying to test humanity. One of them mentions a prophecy he heard from a wandering monk, a prediction that the darkness will lift only after great suffering and sacrifice. You can't help but wonder, is this true? Is there some grand plan behind all of this, or is it just chaos? Historians, even centuries later, debate the psychological impact of such events. How do people make sense of a world that seems intent on destroying them? And one thing is clear, this isn't just a local crisis. Across the globe, similar scenes are playing out. In the Byzantine Empire, Emperor Justinian is grappling with the twin crises of the plague and the cooling climate. His empire, once a beacon of wealth and power, is now teetering on the edge of collapse. Meanwhile, in China, the Wei dynasty faces its own challenges. The cold weather has disrupted agriculture, leading to widespread famine. People resort to eating bark roots and even dirt to survive. Official records describe these times with stark honesty, painting a picture of a society pushed to its limits. Historians still debate whether these interconnected disasters marked the beginning of a broader decline in global civilizations. Some argue that they were simply a temporary setback, while others see them as the start of a darker age. You don't have the luxury of pondering these questions, though. For you, survival is all that matters. As night falls, you return to your small home, grateful for the flimsy roof over your head. You light a fire and sit close to it, trying to ward off the cold. Outside, the wind howls like a restless spirit, and you wonder what tomorrow will bring. Despite everything, you cling to a fragile hope. Maybe the sun will break through the darkness tomorrow. Maybe the worst is over. You close your eyes, holding onto that thought as sleep finally takes you. The morning breaks, but the sun is still a weak, distant glow behind thick gray clouds. You wake up to the damp chill creeping through the cracks in your walls, the fire's warmth already fading. Outside, the world seems suspended in an endless twilight, like a faded photograph stuck between day and night. The air is heavy with a strange silence, broken only by the distant cawing of crows and the occasional creak of a weary tree bending under the weight of years. You remember reading somewhere, probably in a documentary, that 536 was so gloomy people described it as a year without summer. You're living it now, and believe me, you wouldn't last a week without shelter and a warm coat. As you step outside, you notice the crops that once promised bread and life have withered into brittle husks. The fields are barren and crack the soil, clinging stubbornly to dead roots. Farmers stare hopelessly at their ruined harvests, their faces sunken with worry. Hunger has become a constant companion, gnawing at your belly and clouding your thoughts. You can almost taste the bitterness of scarcity in the air. But it's not just food that's scarce. Hope feels like it's running out too. Stories circulate that even the stars are hiding. Astronomers of the time claim to have seen strange halos around the sun, and the moon, eerie dark suns that herald disaster. Historians still argue whether these celestial events were caused by volcanic ash or something more mysterious, but the effect on people is undeniable. When the sky itself looks sick, how can the earth be healthy? You pass a group of children playing a grim game of shadow and light, where one child is the shadow doomed to never see the sun again, chased by others laughing nervously. Their game feels less like play and more like a strange ritual to cope with the dark days. On the outskirts, you spot a monk quietly scribbling in his journal, his eyes reflecting a mixture of awe and dread. Monks during this time were often the only literate observers of these calamities, their writings becoming precious records centuries later. Speaking of writings, here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval chroniclers blamed the year's darkness on a massive volcanic eruption, probably in Iceland. The volcano spewed so much ash into the atmosphere that sunlight barely reached the ground. This theory aligns with recent ice core samples revealing layers of volcanic particles dated precisely to this time. Imagine the sky thick with ash, the sun reduced to a dull ember. Your vitamin D intake practically zero. Forget your usual morning boost, you're basically living in a never-ending twilight. But that's not all. Around this time, the Byzantine Empire's capital, Constantinople, is also suffering under these strange conditions. Emperor Justinian, already juggling wars and political intrigue, now faces a population weakened by cold, hunger, and disease. Imagine running an empire in the middle of what feels like an apocalyptic weather system. No pressure, right? Justinian's reign becomes a focal point for historians debating how environmental crises shape politics and power. Did the gloom contribute to his empire's eventual weakening? Scholars are still piecing that puzzle together. Meanwhile, rural folk turn to folk remedies and rituals to survive. You hear whispers of people burning juniper and juniper berries to cleanse the air, while others resort to strange superstitions like wearing necklaces made of wolf teeth or carrying talismans carved from bone. It's a desperate attempt to protect against unseen forces, perhaps the plague or simply the creeping despair. Speaking of plague, here's a creepy little detail. Some accounts suggest that the plague and the harsh climate may have been connected with the cold weather weakening immune systems and making people more vulnerable to disease. It's a grim synergy of misfortunes piling on top of each other. You wonder what it feels like to live in a time when every day is an uphill battle against nature itself. Despite everything, life stubbornly presses on. People find ways to adapt, even if those ways seem strange to modern eyes. For example, some communities start rationing food meticulously while others barter with unusual goods like salt, which becomes almost as valuable as gold. The idea of money loses its usual meaning when survival is the only currency. You stumble upon a market where a vendor offers dried fish wrapped in moss. It's not exactly gourmet cuisine, but in 536, it's a feast. You chat briefly with the vendor who jokes, "You probably wouldn't last a day without this." The humor feels like a small rebellion against despair. A way to remind each other that life, however harsh, still holds moments of lightness. So, historians still argue whether the hardships of 536 directly led to the decline of the Roman Empire and other major powers, or if they merely hastened an inevitable fall. The debate is fascinating, but for you stuck in the mud and fog of this cursed year, it all boils down to one question. How do you survive when the world itself seems to have turned against you? By nightfall, the cold has seeped into your bones. You build a fire from the last dry wood you can find, its flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the walls. The glow is comforting, a small beacon in a world of gloom. You wrap yourself in a threadbare cloak and settle down, listening to the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of wolves. Sleep beckons, but your mind races with questions about tomorrow, about the sun, about hope. You drift off with the uneasy thought that you're part of a story much bigger than yourself. A story of darkness survival and the stubborn human spirit that refuses to be extinguished. You wake to a faint chill and the heavy smell of damp earth. The sky outside is a dull, unchanging gray, and the sun's pale face barely peeks through the thick veil of clouds and ash. You pull your cloak tighter. Something tells you this gloom isn't going anywhere anytime soon. Welcome back to 536, arguably the worst year to be alive, where every breath feels weighed down by the collective dread hanging in the air. The cold isn't just a minor discomfort. You notice how your fingers ache as if frostbite is settling in early. Food is becoming scarcer by the day, and hunger gnaws at your gut like an unwelcome guest. The withered crops you glimpsed yesterday aren't the only problem now. Livestock are starving too, their bony frames a stark reminder that the circle of life is slowing to a dangerous crawl. You catch yourself eyeing the chickens and goats differently, wondering how long they'll last. People's moods mirror the landscape. Fear and superstition breed like weeds. You overhear villagers muttering about the wrath of the gods and punishment for sins. Someone swears they saw a black comet streaking across the sky, a celestial warning that only fuels the growing anxiety. You remember from history lessons that celestial phenomena often scared people into interpreting natural disasters as divine judgment. Historians still argue whether these portents were real or just stories amplified by fear, but for those living through 536, that distinction didn't matter much. A quirky detail you might find interesting: in some parts of Europe, people resorted to wearing masks stuffed with aromatic herbs, an early, if ineffective, attempt at filtering what they believed was poisonous air. Picture a medieval DIY gas mask, smelling faintly of lavender and rosemary. It probably did nothing to help the actual problems, but at least gave a little psychological relief. Not quite the N95 you'd want today, but hey, innovation has humble beginnings. Meanwhile, rumors swirl about strange creatures wandering the countryside. Wolves growing bolder, wild dogs attacking livestock. Even tales of giant rats emerging from sewers. Some say these beasts are drawn out by the strange weather and the increased number of dead animals. You chuckle to yourself, imagining a medieval monster mash that's more about surviving than dancing. Disease is another grim player on this dark stage. The first whispers of the Justinian plague begin to surface, a pandemic that will devastate populations for years to come. People start falling ill with fevers, chills, and swollen lymph nodes. Medical knowledge at the time is rudimentary, and treatments range from bizarre to tragic. Bloodletting, for instance, is a popular but deadly practice. Doctors literally cut you open to release bad humors. You can't help but wonder if some of these treatments caused more harm than good. Historians still argue whether the Justinian plague was a consequence of the environmental collapse or an independent calamity riding the wave of chaos. Amidst the suffering, there's a strange human resilience. Communities band together, sharing scarce resources and helping one another build shelters against the cold that never fully leaves. You witness quiet acts of kindness, a woman offering a loaf of bread to a starving child, a blacksmith crafting makeshift tools to help farmers salvage what little they can. It's a flicker of warmth in an otherwise cold world. And here's a fascinating fringe tidbit. Some monks claim to have recorded miraculous healings during this period, attributing them to divine intervention or the power of prayer. Skeptics argue these accounts were exaggerated to maintain faith in desperate times, but the stories persist. reminding us that hope often springs from the most unlikely places. The markets, once bustling hubs of trade and gossip, now feel like ghost towns. Bartering replaces currency as trust in coins falters. Gold doesn't fill an empty stomach after all. Salt, spices, and dried fish become prized commodities. You find yourself haggling over a handful of salted cod, feeling like you're playing a medieval version of Survivor. Historians debate the extent to which these economic changes influenced medieval society's transformation. Did the hardships of 536 accelerate the shift from Roman urbanism to medieval rural life? The answer remains elusive, but the evidence points to a world being reshaped by crisis. At night, as the cold deepens and the sky dims even further, you sit by your flickering fire, the flames struggling against the oppressive gloom. The silence is broken by distant howls and the creaking of ancient trees. You clutch your cloak, wondering how many more dawns you can endure in this bleak twilight. The day ends with the unsettling knowledge that survival isn't guaranteed. Each breath is a small victory against the darkness closing in. But somehow, even in this worst of years, life finds a way to cling on, stubborn and relentless. The morning light creeps through the cracks in your shelter, pale and hesitant like a guest unsure if they're welcome. You wake stiff and cold, the dampness from last night still clinging to your skin. You stretch out and brace yourself for another day in this strange, dim world where the sun barely makes an appearance, and the air smells faintly of ash and despair. The trees outside stand like skeletal sentinels, their branches stripped bare by the relentless chill. The ground is soggy and cold beneath your feet, making each step a squelching reminder of the strange weather that has gripped the land for months. You try to ignore the persistent chill crawling up your spine, but it's impossible, not just because of the temperature, but because of the creeping dread in the air. You trudge toward the village square, hoping to find some sign of normal life. Instead, you see the hollowed eyes of people who've lost more than just crops and livestock. They've lost hope. Market stalls lie abandoned, dusted with ash, their goods spoiled or long gone. A child stares at you, clutching a ragged doll, her eyes too old for her years. You want to tell her it'll be all right, but you don't know if you believe it yourself. It's no surprise that the climate catastrophe has triggered a cascade of other disasters. You hear whispers of famine tightening its grip, with food shortages becoming dire. Grain stores are nearly empty, and the harsh weather has made planting next season's crops a gamble at best. Some farmers have turned to desperate measures, burning precious wood for warmth, or venturing further into the forest in search of anything edible. You hear tales of foraging parties returning with nothing but tales of starvation and strange illnesses. Speaking of illness, the Justinian plague has begun its deadly march across Europe and parts of Asia. You hear rumors from travelers sparse and frightening of a disease that spreads quickly and leaves death in its wake. You feel a creeping sense of unease. This plague could be the final nail in the coffin for many. Medical knowledge remains limited. Doctors are baffled, often helpless, and sometimes worse than useless. Their remedies, like purging or herbal concoctions, offer little comfort. Here's a quirky tidbit to lighten the mood a bit. During these harsh times, some communities embraced peculiar protective rituals. People wore garlic garlands believed to ward off evil spirits and presumably plague too. Some even used live frogs tied to their wrists as supposed charms. Imagine your medieval ancestors looking like a Halloween costume experiment gone wrong. Historians still argue whether such rituals had any impact on disease transmission, or were purely psychological. While the political structure of the Byzantine Empire strains under these pressures, other kingdoms far away feel the shockwaves too. The distant Merovingian rulers in what we now call France grapple with dwindling resources and unrest, while the eastern realms of China face similar climatic struggles. You're reminded how interconnected the world was even back then, though far less obviously than today. Now, for a more curious fringe detail, tree rings from this period tell a story of reduced growth, almost like the trees themselves were on pause struggling under layers of dust-blocking sunlight. It's as if the entire planet took a collective deep breath and held it. Scientists today pore over these rings trying to piece together the environmental puzzle of 536. Some historians still argue whether this was a singular event or a series of catastrophes building on one another. As you wander the village, you spot an old man engraving strange symbols onto a stone tablet. You ask what it means, but he just shrugs, muttering something about marking the darkness. You catch a glimpse of a mixture of runes and crude sketches depicting the sun swallowed by clouds. It strikes you how humans always try to make sense of chaos even if their tools and understanding are rudimentary. You find yourself at the edge of a muddy river watching its slow, sluggish flow. You dip your hand in the cold water, noticing how even this vital resource seems subdued. Still, life clings stubbornly. You see a few birds fluttering nervously, their chirps muted against the heavy sky. They too must wonder if the sun will ever return. Historians debate the long-term impacts of 536's environmental crisis. Did it help hasten the end of the Roman world as we know it? Was it a catalyst for the so-called Dark Ages, or merely an unfortunate episode in a broader historical landscape? The answers remain open-shrouded, as much in mystery as the ash-clouded skies themselves. As you return to your shelter, your fingers numb and your heart heavy, you think about the strange resilience of humanity. Despite the darkness, despite the cold, and fear, people carry on. They adapt, they survive, and they tell stories. Stories that you'll carry with you tonight as the shadows lengthen and the cold settles in once more. You wake once again to a sky smudged with thick, unyielding gray like a dirty slate no one bothers to wipe clean. The sun's feeble attempts at breaking through feel like a cosmic joke, a faint tease of warmth that never quite arrives. You wrap your threadbare cloak tighter, feeling the damp chill gnaw at your bones as you step outside. The village is quieter than yesterday, the usual morning bustle replaced by a heavy silence that presses in from all sides. Smoke from a distant fire curls upward, mixing with the ash that never seems to settle. You notice that faces look even more drawn, eyes glazed with exhaustion and the slow creep of despair. You wonder how many of these people have lost family members to hunger or sickness. One piece of solid history anchors this bleak moment: the massive volcanic eruption, likely in Iceland, that spewed enough ash to blanket the entire northern hemisphere. It was so vast that eyewitnesses from Constantinople to China recorded an eerie dimness lasting for more than a year. You, standing in this dim world, get a first-hand taste of that nightmare. The sky is a permanent dusk. The crops fail and the cold tightens its grip on everything. But here's a quirky twist. Some medieval folks believe the darkened skies were a sign of divine wrath. Peasants and nobles alike interpreted the gloom as punishment for humanity's sins. In one particularly odd custom, entire villages would perform elaborate penance rituals, including self-flagellation, and processions wearing masks shaped like animals. Imagine joining a parade where everyone looks like a half-dead badger or a mopey raccoon. Hardly a party, but hey, at least it keeps things interesting. Historians still argue whether these rituals actually helped communities bond or just added to the general misery. Maybe both. Meanwhile, food shortages worsen. You hear that grain stores in Constantinople, once a symbol of the empire's strength, are dangerously low. Starvation threatens entire cities. People resort to eating things you'd never consider: tree bark roots, even the leather from old shoes. One rumor floats around about a man who survived by chewing on his own belt for days. Talk about dedication to fashion. A strange fact to chew on during this time: jellyfish populations in some coastal areas reportedly exploded. Without enough sunlight, the entire marine ecosystem was thrown off balance. This led to massive jellyfish blooms, clogging fishing nets and making the already dire food supply even worse. Imagine trying to catch dinner and ending up with a mouthful of jelly talk about a jelly sandwich. You also learn about the plague which spreads silently and relentlessly. Unlike the more familiar Black Death centuries later, the Justinian plague of 541 is equally terrifying but less understood. It moved along trade routes carried by fleas on rats aboard ships, turning bustling ports into ghost towns. You shudder to think that this invisible enemy might be lurking just around the corner. Another fringe detail, some survivors believed that the plague was spread by demons or witches. They'd hunt down scapegoats, often the vulnerable or the different, hoping to appease unseen forces. Scholars debate how much these beliefs fueled social unrest or whether they inadvertently slowed the spread by isolating suspected individuals. As you make your way through the village, you catch sight of a ragged child drawing crude suns on the walls, tiny rebellions against the darkness. It reminds you how even in the worst times, hope flickers stubbornly like a candle in the wind. Historians ponder whether the year 536 was a singular event or part of a broader pattern of climate instability that shaped the early medieval world. The debates continue much like the slow-moving ash clouds that once cloaked the earth. You sigh the weight of survival heavy but somehow manageable. Because if there's one thing you learn from this dark year, it's that humans are remarkably stubborn creatures. You trudge through the endless gray as the cold clings stubbornly to your skin like an unwelcome shadow. The air tastes sour and stale, carrying the faintest hint of sulfur, a reminder of that monstrous volcano that shook the earth and darkened the sky. Each breath feels heavier, like you're inhaling the weight of a world gone wrong. The year presses on and the harsh reality sinks deeper into daily life. You witness farmers returning from fields that now resemble barren moonscapes, soil crusted with ash and devoid of the life that once sprang from it. The failure of crops isn't just an inconvenience, it's a death sentence for many. You hear rumors of famine sweeping across Europe, Asia, and even parts of North Africa. Even the mighty Byzantine Empire, with its grand palaces and powerful armies, struggles to feed its people. Here's a historical fact. Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, shows a significant decline in growth, during this time confirming that the global climate took a nosedive. Trees grew slowly or not at all, marking a clear environmental crisis that aligns perfectly with written records of darkness and cold. But amidst this gloom, there's a quirky tidbit. Some monks cloistered away in their monasteries believed that the sky's gloom was the work of a celestial dragon swallowing the sun. To counter this cosmic beast, they'd hold all-night vigils filled with chants, drumming, and the occasional firework, although in hindsight, probably not the best idea during a famine. Still, one can't help but picture a bunch of bearded guys waving torches at a cloudy sky hoping to scare away a mythical lizard. Sleep well with that mental image. Historians still argue whether these religious responses provided psychological relief or merely distracted from the harsh realities facing these communities. Did faith become a lifeline or a cruel placebo? Meanwhile, disease spreads its sinister shadow. The Justinian plague tightens its grip, claiming lives by the thousands. You hear terrifying stories of entire villages emptied overnight, their abandoned homes filled with silence and rot. Traders fear travel and markets shrink as people withdraw into their homes, desperate to avoid the invisible killer. A fringe fact to mull over, some scholars suggest that this plague may have actually contributed to the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire. The loss of manpower weakened armies and economies, making it easier for enemies to chip away at once unassailable borders. But this theory remains hotly debated. Could a microbe really topple an empire? Historians are still sorting that out. On the home front, people resort to inventive, if grim, survival tactics. You hear whispers of hunger stones, rocks carved with ominous warnings during droughts, and famines visible only when river levels dropped dangerously low. These stones scattered throughout Europe became eerie markers of hardship and hope. One inscribed with the message, "If you see me weep," seems like it was tailor-made for the spirit of 536. You begin to notice how social order frays under the pressure. Crime rises, neighbors grow suspicious, and the fabric of communities threatens to unravel. There's talk of ghost towns, places once lively but now deserted. You imagine walking through empty streets where wind whistles through broken windows and echoes off crumbling walls. Despite the bleakness, life stubbornly continues. A traveling minstrel strums a lute in a nearby tavern, his voice cracking but determined. The song is about better days, probably a tune your ancestors hummed during dark times too. You pause, letting the melancholy melody wash over you. A reminder that even in despair the human spirit sings. As you settle in for another cold night, you wonder if this year, this miserable, relentless year, will ever end. The ash falls softly like a shroud, and you pull your cloak tighter. Because surviving 536 isn't just about enduring the cold or the famine or the plague, it's about holding on to whatever flicker of hope remains in a world gone dark. You trudge on through the soot-gray dawn, feeling the dampness settle in your bones like a persistent ache. The cold remains a relentless companion, gnawing away at any warmth you manage to cling to. As you glance around, you notice that even the sun seems reluctant to rise fully, casting a weak, flickering light that barely pushes back the shadows. Life in 536 is a grind, and you're no stranger to hardship by now. The crops that once promised sustenance now mock you with their emptiness. Famines tighten their grip, and the cries of starving children echo through villages where laughter used to live. You overhear talk of cannibalism whispered behind closed doors, a taboo so horrifying that it feels almost unreal, yet in some places desperation breaks all bounds. Historical fact. The plague's second wave hits hard this year, known as the Justinian Plague's resurgence. It sweeps through towns like a dark tide, leaving a trail of death that few communities can withstand. Its impact on population and morale is staggering, with some estimates suggesting tens of millions of lives lost worldwide. Meanwhile, here's a quirky bit. In some parts of Europe, people begin wearing plague masks with long, beak-like noses stuffed with herbs and spices. Though you'd think this looks like an early attempt at Halloween costumes, these masks were an earnest attempt to filter out what they believed were miasmas or bad airs that carried disease. The truth. The masks probably did more to scare off neighbors than actual germs. Historians still argue whether these plague masks were truly effective or just a misguided superstition. But hey, if a giant beaked mask helps you sleep at night, maybe it's worth a shot. As the year wears on, the political landscape shifts beneath your feet. Empires falter, borders blur, and old alliances crumble. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian the Sour, once a beacon of strength, now faces mounting challenges from within and beyond. The empire's infrastructure strains under the weight of crisis, and even its famed Hagia Sophia feels the tremors of upheaval. A fringe tidbit. Some accounts claim that Justinian's court was obsessed with astrology and divination, during this period searching the stars for answers amid the chaos. Whether that was a genuine attempt to find guidance or a distraction from harsh realities, scholars remain divided. You notice that despite the darkness, art and literature cling to life. Monks labor over manuscripts by candlelight, copying ancient texts with painstaking care. These fragile scrolls become vessels of hope, a promise that knowledge might survive the darkest times. The irony isn't lost on you while outside the world decays inside these scriptoria. Life is being preserved one painstaking letter at a time. Back in the villages, superstition flourishes. You hear tales of witches and demons blamed for the disasters, and you can't help but wonder if fear itself is becoming a disease spreading faster than any plague. Some communities hold bonfires to cleanse the land, while others lock doors tight, praying for salvation that feels just out of reach. You catch a glimpse of the sky once more, a strange pale sun, casting a ghostly glow through thick clouds. It's a sky that seems to weep ash, and you realize that 536 is not just a year, but a slow, grinding nightmare. Still, you trudge on because giving up isn't an option. Not yet. The sky above is a dim, watery gray, so faintly lit it feels like the world has lost its will to shine. The sun, barely more than a pale disk, struggles through a thick veil of ash and smoke, casting a weak, cold light on everything below. You trudge through the day with a growing sense of dread because the usual rhythms of life have been utterly upended. This is 536, the year when the planet seems to have conspired against you, smothering the world in darkness and despair. You might have heard stories from older folks about bad years before when the crops failed or the rivers ran low. But nothing prepared anyone for what's unfolding now. The heat of summer fails to warm the earth, leaving fields barren and cracked. The cold wind bites into your skin despite it being the middle of the growing season. Hunger gnaws at your belly and the usual signs of life. Chirping birds, buzzing insects, even the hum of busy townsfolk are muted, as if the very heartbeat of the world is slowing. Historical fact. Scientists have used tree rings, yes, the rings inside trees that tell us how old they are and how much they've grown each year, to confirm that 536 marked the beginning of one of the coldest decades in at least 2 millennia. This was caused by at least one massive volcanic eruption, possibly multiple spewing ash high into the atmosphere and blotting out the sun for months on end. That sudden volcanic winter chilled the planet so severely that crops failed everywhere from Europe to Asia. Here's a quirky detail that might make you pause. Icelandic ice core's frozen layers of ice that trap ancient air and dust show spikes of sulfur and volcanic ash from this very time. Some experts speculate that the eruption was so colossal it created a literal volcanic fingerprint that still lingers in the environment today. It's as if the Earth sneezed and changed the course of history in one explosive moment. This event might have been the original inspiration for apocalyptic stories passed down through generations. Imagine that a real-life end-of-the-world scenario baked into ancient myths. Historians still argue whether the eruption came from the volcano Krakatoa in Indonesia, a massive Icelandic volcano, or somewhere else entirely. This debate remains as murky as the skies themselves, thick with ash and mystery. You can almost feel the uncertainty pressing down heavier than the ashen clouds above. Life in the towns and cities has slowed to a crawl. The markets where you'd usually barter for food and goods are eerily quiet. The usual hum of negotiation replaced by tense whispers. With the sun so faint, people struggle to do their work, and the cold makes every task more exhausting. Crops that should have been harvested months ago lie rotting or never ripen at all. Famine is no longer a distant threat, but a daily reality. You see neighbors' growing gaunt faces hollow their eyes, shadowed with worry. One of the strangest aspects of this time is how it stirs deep fear and superstition. Religious leaders of all kinds, pagan priests, Christian bishops, and folk healers are scrambling to make sense of the disaster. Some claim it's divine punishment for mankind's sins. Others that the gods have abandoned the world. The uncertainty breeds conflict as faiths clash and people look for scapegoats. It's a time when hope feels as fragile as the thin sunlight struggling through the haze. Here's a fringe tidbit to consider. Some historians propose that the label Dark Ages, often used to describe the centuries following the collapse of Rome, might have been more literal than metaphorical. They suggest that the world really was plunged into darkness for a time, not just figuratively through cultural and political decline, but physically by a prolonged volcanic winter that dimmed the sun and chilled the earth. So when you think of the darkness of the era, imagine that heavy, smoky sky blotting out the light. Amid this chaos, social order teeters dangerously. Bandits and desperate people prey on the weak. With food scarce, the bonds of community start to fray. People hoard whatever they can, sometimes at the expense of their neighbors. Stories circulate of entire villages disappearing or turning to cannibalism, though historians still debate how widespread these horrors actually were. It's hard to separate fact from the fearful rumors that spread faster than wildfire in a dry forest. Your own survival depends on constant vigilance. Every day you must scavenge what little you can find, sharing meals with family and friends who look just as hollow-eyed as you feel. The cold seeps into your bones. The constant hunger weighs down your spirit. You watch children growing weak and elders fading away helpless against a fate they cannot control, and yet somehow life persists. Even in this grim time, you find moments of fragile beauty, a brief clearing in the sky where the sun shines a little brighter, the stubborn green shoots that poke through cracked earth, the quiet resilience of people holding on to each other. It's a reminder that even in the worst years, the world still spins, still breathes, and still hopes. You glance up at the sky one last time before the dusk settles. The sun is barely visible, a faint circle through the haze. You wonder what tomorrow will bring, if the clouds will finally lift, or if this long shadow will remain a silent witness to the worst year you've ever lived through. The air feels colder today, sharper, as if the world itself is holding its breath. You trudge through the streets with a layer of ash crunching underfoot, the skies still thick with a smoky pall that seems endless. The sun struggles to rise, casting a ghostly light on a land that looks tired, worn down by months of relentless hardship. People move slower now. Shadows of their former selves, their faces etched with worry and exhaustion. You try to hold onto a thread of normalcy, but it slips away like smoke through your fingers. Food is scarce, and what little remains is rationed carefully. Markets are a ghost town. Farmers who once filled the town square with their harvests now return with empty hands or nothing at all. The cold has stunted crops across the continent. The famine's grip tightens, making every meal a desperate gamble. Here's a mainstream fact. The year 536 was just the start of a devastating period, often called the Late Antique Little Ice Age, a stretch of at least 3 decades marked by bitter cold and widespread crop failures. Volcanic eruptions in combination with a mysterious dust veil are thought to have plunged the northern hemisphere into this chill. These natural disasters triggered famines, plagues, and social unrest from Europe all the way to China. Now, for a quirky tidbit, some researchers have found that during this time, tree growth was so suppressed by the cold and darkness that it created what's called a growth hiatus. Imagine a tree so stressed it just stops growing rings for a whole year or more. It's like nature's way of sending a screaming help signal through time frozen in wood for centuries to come. Historians still argue whether the dust veil was caused by a single enormous eruption or a series of volcanic events spaced closely together. This debate is complicated by the overlapping evidence from ice cores, tree rings, and ancient chronicles, but either way, the combined effect was catastrophic. Disease soon follows famine, the two intertwined like a deadly dance. the weakened bodies of survivors become easy prey to illness. You hear whispers of a terrible pestilence spreading through the crowded cities, a sickness that will soon become known as the Plague of Justinian. Though it's still years away, the seeds of this pandemic are planted in the harsh soil of starvation and despair. Meanwhile, daily life becomes a grim exercise in survival. The cold weather forces you to burn more wood to keep your home warm, but wood is scarce too, with forests suffering from the unrelenting cold. The ash settles everywhere on rooftops and water supplies in your food, adding another layer of hardship that tests your patience and resolve. Oddly enough, this gloomy era also spurs some unexpected changes. With fewer crops, trade routes falter and cities shrink, but smaller communities grow tighter. You find yourself depending more on neighbors and family, sharing what little you have. In some places, there's a strange spike in charcoal use as people turn to burning bones and other unlikely fuels to keep warm and cook. It's a grim but inventive adaptation to the scarcity. Here's a fringe tidbit to mull over. Some scholars suggest that the profound changes in climate and society during these years may have influenced early medieval art and literature. The pervasive sense of doom and the imagery of darkness and decay found in manuscripts and carvings might reflect the harsh realities people live through, encoded in symbols and stories that survive to this day. You also notice that records from the time sometimes mix fact with superstition. People attribute the disasters to wrathful gods, vengeful spirits, or cosmic punishment. Some claim the sky darkened because dragons or demons flew overhead, while others see it as a sign of the end times. These beliefs shape social behavior and sometimes cause violent outbreaks against marginalized groups blamed for the calamities. Through it all, you cling to hope, a fragile ember in the smoggy gloom. You look to the sky, still dim and smoky, and wonder how long this darkness will last. Will the sun ever shine as brightly again? Will the earth recover its warmth, its bounty? The answer, as you soon learn, is not simple. The trials of 536 are only the beginning of a long struggle, a chapter in a history that will shape the world for centuries to come. For now, you breathe in the cold air, brace yourself for another night under a heavy gray sky, and wait. You wake up under a sky still dull with ash, the kind of light that feels borrowed from a distant, gloomy planet. The chill creeps into your bones, reminding you that this long winter is no ordinary season. You pull your cloak tighter, your breath visible in the cold air, and step outside, noticing how the world around you feels, suspended between sleep and wakefulness, as if waiting for something else to break the endless gray. The crops you hoped would survive last year's frost are mostly lost fields once golden. Now look like barren earth, cracked and tired. Farmers share tales of strange bitter taste in the soil and seeds that never sprouted. You hear talk of birds migrating at odd times and animals behaving erratically, all signs that nature itself seems out of rhythm. The world feels off-kilter, and your stomach reminds you that hunger is now as persistent as the cold. One well-known fact: the mysterious mystery cloud that dimmed the sun in 536 continued to affect the climate for several years, with 537 and 538 seeing continued cold and wet conditions that decimated harvests across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. Some historians suggest that these years saw the worst of the crop failures in the entire late antique Little Ice Age, contributing to famine on an unprecedented scale. Here's a quirky tidbit. Contemporary Byzantine chroniclers wrote that the sun gave only a feeble light like the moon, and many described the days as dim as twilight even at noon. One poet lamented that the seasons had lost their names and their order, plunging life into chaos. It's almost as if the sun itself was on a stubborn vacation, and everyone was left waiting for its return. Historians still argue whether the dust was from a massive volcanic eruption near Iceland, or possibly a series of eruptions combined with cometary debris falling into the atmosphere. The debate centers on how to best interpret data from ice cores in Greenland and Antarctica tree rings, and written accounts from various cultures that describe strange skies and cold weather. As you wander through a village, the mood is somber, but tinged with strange rituals. People burn incense and herbs to ward off evil spirits they believe have descended along with the darkness. Others perform ceremonies asking the gods for mercy, creating a mix of hope and desperation that hangs thick in the chilly air. The famine is relentless. You see children with swollen bellies and gaunt faces, a cruel paradox of hunger and disease. Food prices skyrocket, and bread, once common, becomes a luxury. To stretch supplies, some families mix sawdust or crushed bark into their meals, hardly the feast they once enjoyed. Markets fill with strange remedies, some made of crushed animal bones or herbs, said to protect against the bad air that many believe is spreading sickness. On the fringe, some communities develop what looks like early food preservation techniques, like burying food underground or smoking it to last longer, showing human resilience even in the darkest times. You can't help but admire these small acts of ingenuity amid the widespread despair. Meanwhile, the geopolitical landscape shifts. Empires and kingdoms struggle to maintain order, with food shortages and disease outbreaks weakening armies and governments. The Byzantine Empire, once a beacon of stability, is battered by plague and famine. The Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian the Feeds faces crises on multiple fronts, his reign shadowed by these apocalyptic events. Remember those eerie reports from earlier? Some scholars propose that the social unrest, the rebellions, and the rapid changes in leadership during this time were indirectly fueled by the climatic disaster. This intertwining of environment and politics remains a topic historians debate vigorously. Even religion is shaken. Some clergy interpret the disasters as divine punishment, preaching repentance, while others push for reform and hope. This spiritual turmoil adds another layer to the complex picture of 536 and the years that follow. As you close your eyes tonight, the cold wind whispering outside your window, you wonder how long this twilight world will last. The sun is still hiding, but beneath the surface, life stirs. History waits ready to turn its page, even if it's slower and more painful than anyone wishes. You trudge along a muddy, slippery path every step, sinking slightly into the soft earth, as if the ground itself is trying to swallow you whole. The sky above is a thick, unyielding gray, like a heavy wool blanket, stretched tight, blotting out any hint of sunlight. The air feels cold and damp, and your breath comes out in short, misty puffs that quickly fade into the gloom. Around you, the trees stand bare and skeletal, their twisted branches clawing at the sky like desperate hands. It's a world stripped of warmth and color, drained of vitality by the relentless, oppressive atmosphere. This is what life felt like in the years after 536 AD, the period that historians now often call the worst year to be alive. The climate had shifted dramatically, plunging the northern hemisphere into an unending winter that refused to relent. Crops withered in the fields, rivers froze in the summer, and the sun barely peeked through the thick clouds, casting an eerie twilight over the land. Imagine waking up each day knowing you'll face another cold, gray stretch of hours with no real hope of sunlight or warmth. It's enough to wear down the strongest spirit. Here's one firm historical fact to grasp: the mysterious climate disaster around 536 was likely triggered by massive volcanic eruptions, probably a series of them that spewed ash and sulfur dioxide high into the stratosphere. These particles blocked sunlight, causing temperatures to plunge drastically worldwide for several years. The result was a catastrophic drop in agricultural productivity. But what's fascinating is that this environmental crisis wasn't a one-time event. The volcanic activity apparently continued for several years, dragging the world into a prolonged dark age of chilling cold and starvation. Now for something a bit quirkier. Medieval chroniclers, understandably bewildered by the sudden, unexplainable darkness, described the sun as a dim red orb, likening it to a bloodied and wounded light hanging in the sky. Some even suggested it looked like a half-dead ember. But what's especially intriguing is that some ancient texts mention bizarre atmospheric phenomena, faint glowing lights at night, sometimes called fiery serpents or dragon's fire. Modern scientists speculate these could have been electrical storms ignited by volcanic ash particles suspended in the air, producing eerie, ghostly illuminations. It's the kind of eerie detail that makes you pause and wonder what it must have been like to live through. But the misery didn't stop at just the cold and darkness. Historians still argue about how this relentless gloom may have set the stage for one of history's deadliest pandemics, the Justinian Plague, which emerged around 541 AD. Was the plague's deadly sweep accelerated by the mass starvation, malnutrition, and displacement caused by the climate disaster? It's hard to say for certain, but the timing suggests that the two were linked, creating a perfect storm of suffering. People weakened by hunger and cold would have been more vulnerable to disease, and the chaotic movement of refugees and armies might have helped spread the plague rapidly across continents. Walking through the deserted villages, you can almost hear the silence pressing in. Marketplaces that once bustled with life now stand empty or barely functional, the stalls offering only meager, spoiled goods. People huddle around small fires not just for warmth, but for the flickering comfort of light and companionship. Children are gaunt, their cheeks hollowed by hunger, and elders look drained beyond their years. The smell of damp wood and smoke hangs thick in the air, yet amid all this hardship, human resilience flickers faintly like a candle struggling against the dark. In some communities, people turn to brewing herbal concoctions believed to stave off hunger or illness, simple remedies made from nettles, dandelions, or willow bark. Others experiment with primitive forms of protection, crafting makeshift masks from cloth or animal sinew to shield themselves from invisible threats in the air, an early instinct at disease prevention. It's a testament to human ingenuity when survival is at stake. Meanwhile, in the halls of power, Emperor Justinian III faces a dilemma that would rattle any ruler. His dreams of restoring the glory of the Roman Empire clash bitterly with the harsh reality. His people are starving, the plague is ravaging cities, and resources are stretched thin. Empress Theodora, his formidable wife and advisor, reportedly urged him to focus on survival over conquest, a call for pragmatism in the face of overwhelming odds. It's a reminder that even the mightiest ambitions can be humbled by the forces of nature. Remember how the sky seemed dim and the sun was little more than a faint glow. Some historians argue that the psychological impact of living under constant twilight was as damaging as the physical suffering. A world where daylight fades to near darkness can breed hopelessness and despair, weakening social bonds and fueling superstition. Religious fervor surges in response. Pilgrimages to holy sites increase as people seek divine intervention. At the same time, apocalyptic prophecies abound, interpreting the disasters as signs of the end times. The air is thick with prayers, but also fear and fatalism. You might chuckle at the sight of merchants hawking miracle cures made from dubious ingredients. Herbs, animal parts, prayers, all sold with grand promises to stave off death. Desperation breeds belief, and belief can sometimes be the last fragile thread holding people together. As darkness deepens on this cold day, you wonder how much more your spirit can bear. Yet beneath the gloom, life stubbornly persists. Somewhere in the damp soil, seeds wait for the return of warmth. Somewhere in the tired hearts, hope waits too. You step cautiously through the ruins of what was once a bustling marketplace, now a ghostly silence, hanging over cracked stone and splintered wood. The air is thick with the lingering scent of smoke and rot, the result of fires hastily lit for warmth, in a place where trade has all but ceased. It's the year 537 AD, and the world is still reeling from the volcanic winter that began the previous year, blanketing the skies in ash and plunging temperatures into a relentless chill. You rub your arms, feeling the bite of the cold that no amount of wool or leather seems to fully repel. Life around you is a fragile thread stretched thinner with each passing day. Food is scarce, and the staple grains that once filled storehouses have failed to grow in the shattered fields. You try to imagine what a day's routine looks like for the average person. Long, exhausting hours foraging for whatever roots, nuts, or wild greens you can find, or perhaps fishing in near-frozen rivers where the fish are fewer and more elusive. Hunger gnaws steadily at your belly, a constant reminder of your vulnerability. One well-established historical fact you can't ignore is how this year saw a significant disruption in the Byzantine Empire's food supply. Crops failed not only because of the cold, but also due to persistent rains and poor sunlight, a lethal combination. As a result, famine spread rapidly through cities and countryside alike. This contributed heavily to the already staggering toll of the Justinian plague, which was circulating alongside starvation and cold, a deadly trio that crushed populations in waves. But here's where things get even stranger. Some medieval chroniclers writing centuries later describe an ominous phenomenon known as the year without a summer. What's quirky about this is that in some regions, despite the oppressive cold, there were reports of bizarre weather events like snow in June or July, and dense fogs that smelled faintly of sulfur, clear signs that the atmosphere was still poisoned by volcanic gases. The fogs were so thick in some areas that travelers lost their way wandering for days in a surreal smoke-filled haze. Some even claim to see phantom lights or hear unexplainable sounds, leading to wild superstitions that the land itself was cursed. Historians still argue whether this prolonged period of volcanic winter contributed directly to the collapse of certain city-states or rural communities during this decade. Was the slow death of agriculture the main factor? Or did the psychological toll of enduring unending gray skies and failed harvests play an equally vital role? We may never fully know, but it's clear that the societal fabric was stretched dangerously thin. You find yourself near a small village where the church bell tolls, mournfully echoing through the mist like a slow heartbeat. Inside, villagers gather not just for worship, but also to share whatever news and scraps of food remain. In such desperate times, the church served as both spiritual refuge and social hub. The clergy preached sermons, urging faith and patience, sometimes warning of divine punishment for the sins of mankind, a reminder that hope and fear often walk hand in hand during crises. Another quirky detail to consider: some of these religious leaders began documenting strange astronomical events. In one manuscript, a monk describes seeing a blood moon that lasted for several nights, likely a lunar eclipse seen through a haze of volcanic ash, interpreting it as a celestial omen of doom. This blending of natural phenomena with superstition adds a layer of complexity to how people understood their suffering, often seeing cosmic forces at work in their personal tragedies. Meanwhile, in the courts of Europe, rulers struggle to maintain order. Taxes still must be collected, but the subjects have little to give. Bands of desperate peasants and displaced families wander in search of food, sometimes turning to banditry. The notion of feudal protection weakens when lords cannot provide sustenance or security. In some regions, historians still debate whether these crises accelerated the decline of Roman institutions and paved the way for the feudal fragmentation of Europe. You pause at a frozen riverbank, noticing the thin, brittle ice cracking under your boots. The rivers are crucial lifelines carrying trade and food supplies, but this year, many have frozen solid or overflowed due to unusual weather patterns. The resulting flooding adds to the misery, washing away fields and homes. Stories tell of entire villages swept away or buried under mudslides, disasters compounded by the lack of sunlight and warmth. Amid the desolation, some communities turn to ingenious survival strategies. You hear of early forms of crop rotation and seed preservation, desperate experiments to coax life from the earth. Others tried burning sulfur or herbs to cleanse the air, a primitive attempt at combating what they believed was a toxic miasma. These efforts show the flicker of human creativity in the darkest times, even if many were doomed to fail. There's a curious lesser-known fact that in parts of Asia, especially China, officials kept detailed records of the cold years and failed harvests. Some of these documents mention famines so severe that entire villages disappeared, swallowed by starvation and migration. This global perspective reminds you that the year 536 and its aftermath were not isolated events but shared catastrophes spanning continents. Returning to Europe, you imagine the plight of children during this period. We know from skeletal remains that malnutrition was rampant. Teeth are worn down from eating coarse, gritty food. Bones show signs of disease and stunted growth. It's heartbreaking to picture little ones wrapped in threadbare clothes, their laughter muted by hunger and exhaustion. Yet, in some accounts, children are also seen as sources of hope, symbols of continuity amid chaos. Speaking of hope, there are intriguing tales of hidden pockets of relative prosperity. Certain isolated communities or monasteries manage to store food or cultivate sheltered gardens, their inhabitants weathering the storm better than most. This has led historians to debate whether human adaptation during this period was more nuanced than previously thought. Did some groups innovate to survive while others succumbed? It seems survival was often a matter of luck, geography, and social structure. As you trudge back toward a small hearth, the wind howling softly through the cracked windows, you reflect on the eerie stillness that has settled over the land. The year 537 is not just a continuation of 536's horrors, but an expansion. A time when the consequences of environmental collapse seep deeper into every corner of human existence. In these bleak times, stories and myths flourish as people try to make sense of their suffering. The idea that the world is ending or that evil forces roam freely gains traction. You might find it oddly comforting or terrifying that even in the worst years, human imagination remains vivid, shaping the culture that will eventually emerge from the ashes. The sun may be a dim red orb, but the human spirit flickers with a stubborn light. And though the future feels uncertain and cold somewhere beneath this gray sky, life clings on. You stumble through the cold morning mist, the ground beneath your feet, muddy and uneven each step, a small battle against the lingering chill. The sky above is a dull, leaden gray, the sun, nothing more than a faint glow behind thick clouds heavy with ash and frost. It's the year 538 AD, the world still grappling with the fallout from what many call the worst year to be alive. And here you are trying to understand just how deep the wounds run and what daily life feels like when the very fabric of nature seems to unravel around you. Food remains the dominant concern. This isn't just the regular hardship of medieval life, but a crisis of catastrophic proportions. You watch as a farmer attempts to coax the last scraps from a field, his breath visible in the freezing air. This year's crop failure is even worse than the last. The cold and dark have persisted so long that soils are exhausted and seeds refuse to sprout. Starvation spreads with silent, cruel efficiency. Entire villages vanish as people either perish or flee to towns, already bursting at the seams. It's a grim reminder that agriculture was the lifeblood of medieval society, and when that fails, survival becomes a tenuous gamble. One mainstream historical fact is that during this period, the Eastern Roman Empire or Byzantine Empire faced crippling food shortages compounded by continued volcanic aftereffects and relentless outbreaks of plague. Emperor Justinian's court was strained beyond belief, with grain shipments delayed or destroyed and tax revenues drying up. The strain on administration and military defense was immense, opening cracks in an empire that had already been bruised by previous conflicts. Yet amid this grim reality, there are quirky details worth noting. For example, in some areas, animals behaved strangely. Livestock began dying in unusual numbers, and farmers whispered about mad cows and cursed beasts. Reports likely exaggerated, but probably rooted in the stress and malnutrition animals endured. Some chroniclers even described flocks of birds flying erratically or dropping dead mid-flight, a bizarre phenomenon that fueled fear and superstition. In remote villages, shamans and healers claimed that spirits were angry, and that sacrifices were necessary to restore balance, leading to a spike in ritualistic practices. Historians still argue whether these animal anomalies were due directly to toxins in the environment, volcanic ash and gases contaminating grazing lands, or whether they were psychosomatic reports spurred by collective anxiety. The truth probably lies somewhere in between a mix of environmental disruption and human interpretation trying to make sense of inexplicable suffering. Walking deeper into a town, you notice the crumbling infrastructure walls patched hastily, roofs leaking, and wells fouled by flooding. Public health has taken a nosedive. The plague continues its grim march, carried by rats and fleas that thrive in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. The famous Justinian plague of this era has not been vanquished. Instead, it resurges in waves, striking down people of all ages. Your imagined footsteps bring you into a crowded street, where a family mourns the loss of a child, their sobs muffled by the relentless drizzle. The plague's social impact cannot be overstated. Labor shortages disrupt farming and craft production, which in turn exacerbates food scarcity and economic decline. You might think that this could prompt new social orders or reforms, but instead it leads to fragmentation and fear-driven conservatism. People cling harder to tradition and religious explanations. Here lies a peculiar historical nuance. While the pandemic causes devastation, it also seeds future changes in how societies understand disease and health. An odd, yet fascinating fringe fact is that some communities began experimenting with rudimentary quarantine measures. Certain ports enforced isolation for arriving ships, and some towns established plague houses to separate the sick from the healthy. These early public health interventions reveal a flicker of rationality amidst widespread panic. It's almost as if in the midst of chaos, human beings instinctively start building the foundations of modern epidemiology. Meanwhile, intellectual life does not entirely disappear. Monasteries become beacons of relative stability. Monks, often immune or better protected, continue to copy manuscripts and preserve knowledge. Some scholars debated whether the calamities were divine punishment or natural phenomena, a theological versus scientific discussion that persists to this day. This debate highlights an essential aspect of 6th century thought, the blending of religion and emerging reason in explaining disaster. You wander past a workshop where a craftsman struggles to repair tools and weapons. Metals are scarce because trade routes are disrupted by war and famine. Historians still argue whether the loss of resources accelerated the military decline of many regions, leaving them vulnerable to invasion or rebellion. It's a chicken or egg question, but the decline in production and defense capabilities certainly worsens the already fragile political landscape. Speaking of politics, this year is not just about natural disaster, it's also a time of turmoil. Rival kingdoms and factions take advantage of the chaos to seize power. In some regions, petty warlords rise, controlling fragmented territories with little oversight. The old Roman imperial structures crumble, replaced by unstable, localized power centers. This feudalization process, historians argue, is linked to the environmental and health catastrophes of this decade. The breakdown of central authority makes life even more precarious for common people like you. Yet, despite the despair, stories of resilience emerge. Some communities band together to share resources, build communal granaries, or organize defenses against raiders. You imagine the quiet heroism of everyday folk whose names were never recorded but whose actions ensured survival. This human determination is a beacon amid darkness, the silver lining in an otherwise bleak narrative. On a lighter note, you might find it amusing that in some places people began wearing masks made of cloth or animal skins, early attempts at protection that, although ineffective by modern standards, show an instinctual understanding of contagion. It's a bit like watching your neighbor don a snorkel to avoid catching a cold, futile yet endearing. As night falls, you picture families huddled by small fires, telling stories or praying for an end to the misery. The cold seeps through stone walls and wooden beams, but human warmth remains a fragile, flickering comfort. The year 538 is a relentless continuation of hardship, yet within it lie the seeds of change and adaptation. Remember that blood moon from earlier years. Now the skies are less dramatic, but no less oppressive. The volcanic ash has thinned, but the damage done to climate and society lingers. You feel the weight of survival pressing down, yet also the slow pulse of life trying to reclaim its rhythm. The road ahead is uncertain, and the struggles of this year will echo for decades. But for now, in this damp, cold evening, you are simply a witness to history's darkest chapter, waiting for the faintest hint of dawn. You step into the chilly dawn of the year 539 AD, the air still thick with the invisible residue of volcanic dust, a persistent reminder of the cataclysmic events that have reshaped the world around you. The landscape you traverse is unrecognizable. Fields once lush and fertile now lie barren, and rivers run low or muddied, their waters carrying ash instead of the usual clear flow. It's as if nature itself has withdrawn its bounty, leaving humanity to grapple with the harsh consequences. You feel the cold bite through your simple woolen cloak, and the dampness clings stubbornly to your boots. The year 539 does not bring relief. Instead, it deepens the malaise gripping Europe, Asia, and parts of Africa. Food shortages have become systemic. The failures of the previous year's harvests have triggered famines that are no longer localized, but widespread their reach, extending into places that had never before known hunger. You see skeletal figures trudging along dirt roads, gaunt faces sunken with desperation, clutching the few belongings they can carry. Markets once bustling with traders are now ghostly echoes of their former selves, as commerce grinds to a halt under the pressure of scarcity and fear. One mainstream historical fact is that the Justinian plague continues its relentless spread, ravaging the population. This pandemic, named after Emperor Justinian the Run, strikes indiscriminately. Peasants, nobles, and clergy alike fall victim. The plague's waves come in cycles, each resurgence as deadly as the last, and with each wave, society's ability to cope erodes further. Reports tell of towns losing half or even two-thirds of their inhabitants, leaving behind empty homes and abandoned fields. But there's more to this bleak reality. A quirky, almost surreal detail emerges from chroniclers of the time. Some describe strange weather phenomena, including blood rains and eerie red skies. These may have been caused by atmospheric dust filtering sunlight in unusual ways. But to the terrified population, such omens were signs of apocalypse. In some areas, people reported hearing unexplainable noises, low hums or distant thunder without storms, which some historians speculate could have been related to volcanic activity or seismic unrest. These stories, part natural phenomenon and part folklore, illustrate how communities struggled to interpret the world's collapse. Historians still argue whether these environmental anomalies had direct effects on human psychology, possibly exacerbating mass hysteria and social breakdowns. The exact impact remains debated, but there is no doubt that fear and superstition flourished in these dark times. You follow the dusty path into a small village where you witness the impact of social collapse firsthand. The local lord's manor, once a center of governance and protection, now stands half empty, its walls scarred by neglect. Peasants gather cautiously, whispering about raids from desperate neighbors or mercenaries taking advantage of the chaos. The breakdown of law and order is palpable. Banditry increases as starving men resort to theft to survive. You feel the tension in the air, a constant unease that never quite dissipates. Yet within this turmoil, some villages experiment with new forms of communal support. You hear stories of villagers pooling what little food they have, rationing carefully to prevent anyone from starving outright. These rudimentary social safety nets are patchy and fragile, but represent a flicker of solidarity. It's a testament to human resilience that, even in the face of overwhelming adversity, cooperation can arise. An intriguing fringe detail is that some of these communities began adjusting their agricultural practices. Faced with a hostile climate, farmers experimented with new crops thought to be more resistant to cold and poor soil. While wheat struggled to mature, barley and rye became preferred staples in some regions, and legumes were introduced more widely for their nitrogen-fixing properties to enrich the soil. This experimentation laid early groundwork for agricultural adaptation that historians believe helped medieval Europe recover centuries later. Meanwhile, intellectual life faces its own trials. Monasteries remain the centers of learning and refuge, but many are overwhelmed by the sheer number of sick and dying. Still, monks continue their scribal work, copying ancient texts and religious manuscripts. Some scholars debate whether the disruptions caused by famine and plague might have contributed to a slowdown in knowledge transmission during this period, or if the very chaos inspired renewed interest in preserving wisdom. You catch whispers of this debate as you pass a monastery gate. A learned abbot argues with a visiting scholar about whether the plague is divine punishment or a natural phenomenon caused by bad air, an early precursor to the miasma theory of disease. This conversation encapsulates the period's struggle to understand calamity through both spiritual and emerging empirical lenses. Back in the towns, public health measures remain rudimentary but evolve slowly. The idea of quarantine, while still primitive, becomes more widely accepted. You imagine guards stationed at city gates turning away travelers showing signs of sickness, or isolating entire households. Some cities mandate cleaning of streets and disposal of waste in an attempt to stem the plague's spread. These measures are inconsistent and often ineffective, but they reveal the dawning awareness that disease can be contained by human intervention. An odd yet memorable detail from this period is that some people began carrying amulets or charms believed to ward off the plague. These range from religious symbols to bizarre concoctions of herbs and spices. It's a bit like seeing your great-grandparents sporting garlic necklaces during flu season. More hopeful than helpful, but important psychologically. This mix of superstition and early science underlines the human need to find control in chaos. The political landscape remains fragmented. The Eastern Roman Empire still struggles to maintain authority in distant provinces. At the same time, emerging powers in Western Europe, such as the Franks, begin consolidating territory, setting the stage for future medieval kingdoms. Some historians argue that the upheaval of the mid-6th century accelerated the transition from classical antiquity to the early Middle Ages, a theory supported by the breakdown of Roman infrastructure and governance. You picture a weary soldier trudging along a damaged road, his armor patched and dented. The empire's banners faded and tattered. The army is a shadow of its former self, hampered by logistical failures and declining morale. It's a powerful image of a civilization in decline, caught between trying to hold on and an unstoppable tide of change. In homes, families continue to adapt. You imagine a mother grinding barley flour by hand while keeping an eye on her children, all under the threat of hunger and illness. The medieval diet has become more austere, and luxury is a forgotten concept. Some foods once prized, now scarce or impossible to obtain. Spices from the East, rare fruits, even fresh meat. Instead, people rely on root vegetables, legumes, and whatever grains manage to survive the harsh conditions. One more quirky detail. In some regions, people began using a form of herbal medicine drawn from native plants, thought to boost immunity or alleviate symptoms. These remedies were a mixture of observation, tradition, and desperation. Some worked, some didn't, but they represent an important continuity in folk medicine that would evolve over the centuries. As the day ends, you feel the heavy weight of survival pressing down, but also the slow stirrings of hope. Communities, though battered, persist. People adapt, learn, and continue. The year 539 is far from over, but it marks a continued journey through one of the darkest epochs of human history. One where every breath is a small victory. Remember that eerie red sky from last year tonight? It fades into a more typical twilight, though the air still tastes faintly of ash. You settle in with the knowledge that while nature's fury is relentless, so too is the stubborn pulse of life. You wake up in the lingering gloom of 540 AD with the heavy scent of ash and despair still hanging thick in the air. The volcanic winter, that unyielding shroud of cold and darkness, persists like an unwelcome guest that refuses to leave. The sunlight is weak, filtered through layers of dust, casting everything in a surreal gray hue. Your breath clouds in front of you as the chill creeps into your bones, making each step feel heavier than the last. You trudge through muddy, half-frozen fields where the earth refuses to give up its nourishment. Hunger gnaws at your belly, and the thought of food seems more like a cruel joke than a promise. Despite these crushing hardships, the world is still turning, and humanity is still struggling to adapt. The year 540 does not offer respite. It only deepens the crisis that has already been dragging on for years. As you navigate this bleak landscape, you notice signs of both collapse and resilience, villages abandoned, but new communities forming. Despair, but also flickers of hope. One well-documented historical fact is the continuation of the Justinian plague's relentless spread. This pandemic, which first appeared in 541 AD, is no ordinary disease. Its black buboes and fever have decimated populations, wiping out as much as a third or even half of entire cities. The plague moves like a shadow, invisible but lethal, carried by rats and fleas, spreading through trade routes and cramped urban streets alike. You witness entire households wiped out, empty homes standing as grim monuments to lives snuffed out too soon. Yet amid this grim reality, some peculiar details stand out. For example, the plague inspired a unique phenomenon: mass religious processions and fervent displays of penance. People believed the disease was divine punishment and tried to appease the gods or saints with elaborate rituals. These processions could draw thousands, creating crowds where the plague spread even faster, an ironic and tragic twist. It's a haunting image, people lining the streets, chanting and pleading, only to become unwitting victims themselves. Historians still argue whether these religious responses helped communities maintain morale or inadvertently worsen the plague's impact by facilitating its spread. The debate also extends to how religious leaders themselves responded. Some advocated isolation and prayer, while others encouraged these large gatherings. This tension between faith and practical public health measures is a theme that resonates even in our modern times. You move through a city devastated by the plague, perhaps Constantinople or Rome, and you notice how the fabric of society is unraveling. Cemeteries overflow. Mass graves become common. Funeral rites are hurried or neglected altogether, leaving the dead to lie where they fell. Gravediggers refuse to work out of fear, and relatives avoid the sick and dying. The emotional toll is palpable. The city feels hollowed out, a shell of its former grandeur. Amid the chaos, some quirky and unexpected stories emerge. In some regions, you hear of plague doctors, mysterious figures clad in strange masks with long beaks stuffed with aromatic herbs. These masks were believed to protect against miasma, the bad air thought to carry the disease. While the protective value of these masks is debated, their eerie appearance has become iconic. The fact that such specialized roles existed so early hints at early attempts at epidemiology and disease control. At the same time, you encounter the rise of new social dynamics. Labor shortages caused by mass deaths mean that peasants and workers find themselves with more bargaining power. Wages rise in some areas, and serfdom's rigid structures begin to loosen. This shift is a slow and uneven process, but it marks a critical transformation in medieval society. For the first time in centuries, common people have leverage, and the seeds of future social change are sown. An intriguing fringe tidbit. Some chroniclers report bizarre sightings during these plague years: phantom processions, strange lights in the sky, and unexplained sounds. Were these collective hallucinations born of mass trauma or genuine unknown phenomena? While modern historians often dismiss these as folklore or psychological effects of stress, they offer a glimpse into how people tried to make sense of the unthinkable. In the rural countryside, the story is different but equally grim. Farmers struggle to maintain their lands with fewer hands. Fields go untended and livestock numbers dwindle. Starvation looms large, forcing some families to abandon their homes or resort to desperate measures. Tales circulate of people resorting to eating bark roots or even cannibalism in extreme cases, dark stories that reflect the depths of human desperation. At the same time, small enclaves of stability emerge. Some monasteries manage to maintain agricultural production and offer refuge. Monks work tirelessly copying manuscripts by candlelight, preserving knowledge even as the world around them crumbles. You can almost hear the scratch of quills on parchment, a tiny defiance against the engulfing darkness. These monasteries will become the vital bridges to the future, safeguarding learning and culture through the ages. There's a fascinating academic debate on whether the devastation wrought by the plague and climate disaster accelerated the end of the Roman Empire and the onset of the so-called Dark Ages. Some scholars argue that these events created a reset that forced Europe into a prolonged period of cultural and technological stagnation. Others contend that this period was more a transformation than a decline, with new powers and ideas slowly emerging from the chaos. Meanwhile, the natural world reacts in strange ways. With fewer humans to till the land or hunt animals, some wildlife populations swell. Wolves, bears, and other predators venture closer to abandoned villages, reclaiming spaces once dominated by people. Forests begin to encroach on fields, slowly reclaiming what was lost. It's a reminder that while humanity suffers, nature continues its cycles indifferent to human tragedy. On a more personal note, you find yourself contemplating how this era forced people to confront mortality daily. The concept of death was never far, but now it's a constant presence, an unavoidable shadow. This reality shaped art, religion, and philosophy. The emergence of memento mori themes, the reminders of death in paintings and literature, begin here. People carry skull motifs and reflect on the fragility of life, a cultural shift that echoes through centuries. And yet, amid all the despair, life persists. You overhear laughter from a small group of children playing in the mud, their innocence untouched by the harsh world around them. You glimpse a couple sharing a quiet moment, their love a fragile but vital flame. These small acts of humanity underscore that even in the darkest years, hope can flicker. As night falls, the ash-laden sky darkens prematurely, and you prepare for another day in a world that has been forever changed. The year 540 is marked by loss, adaptation, and a grim determination to survive. It's a chapter in history where nature and disease remind us of their power, but also where human spirit refuses to be extinguished. Remember that strange red sky from last year tonight? It's back, an eerie glow that hints the volcanic forces beneath the earth are still at work. You tuck yourself in, listening to the distant rumble, and let your mind drift through the centuries, knowing that this catastrophic time laid the groundwork for the world to come. You awaken to a dawn that barely registers as morning. The sun, a dim, reddish orb, struggles to pierce the thick canopy of volcanic ash and dust hanging low over the land. The air is heavy and strange, carrying a faint sulfurous smell that clings to your clothes and skin like a stubborn stain. Around you, the world feels suspended, caught between life and something else entirely. It's 541 AD and the worst year is still holding its grip. One major historical fact you can't ignore is the continuing turmoil in the Byzantine Empire, which was still grappling with the devastating impact of the Justinian plague that began the previous year. Constantinople, the imperial capital, was losing citizens at an alarming rate. Entire neighborhoods emptied, markets deserted, and once bustling forums eerily silent. Trade faltered, and with it, the economy teetered dangerously on the brink. The empire's very survival seemed uncertain. Interestingly, despite all the misery, the plague also led to unexpected shifts in art and culture. Some Byzantine artists turned to creating haunting, morbid mosaics and frescoes reflecting the suffering and uncertainty around them. It's a grim but fascinating artistic reaction, almost like a collective coping mechanism, channeling fear into creativity. The depiction of angels and saints comforting the afflicted became more common, a reflection of both hope and despair. Historians still argue whether the plague directly weakened the Byzantine military, or if other factors like political intrigue and economic stress played equally crucial roles in the empire's vulnerability to external threats. This debate touches on the complexities of how interconnected crises often combine to reshape history. Meanwhile, the landscape outside the cities is equally grim, but layered with quirks. You notice strange phenomena reported by peasants' trees bearing fruit in odd colors or sizes, animals behaving erratically in bizarre weather patterns like hailstorms in midsummer. These anomalies probably stem from the ongoing volcanic disruptions, but they fed into local superstitions and folklore. Some villagers believed the world was unraveling, while others thought a great cleansing was underway. One fringe tidbit from this era involves the so-called dancing plagues. Bizarre events where groups of people were said to dance uncontrollably for days on end, sometimes until collapse. While most documented cases occurred a century later, some chroniclers hint at similar episodes here, possibly triggered by mass hysteria or ergot poisoning. It's a strange glimpse into how trauma might manifest physically in human communities. As you move through this unsettled world, you come across small pockets of resistance and adaptation. Some rural communities have taken to new agricultural methods, planting crops that tolerate colder, gloomier conditions better than traditional grains. They experiment with root vegetables and hardy legumes, hoping to stave off famine. This agricultural innovation might seem small, but could have long-term consequences for survival and societal resilience. On the flip side, many cities are transforming in response to the crisis. Public health measures, rudimentary as they are, begin to take shape. Some towns quarantine affected households or impose travel restrictions, even if these actions are inconsistently applied. You imagine the confusion and fear as people try to balance communal care with self-preservation. It's early public health stumbling, but vital. A quirky fact you might find amusing is the proliferation of charms and amulets, supposedly protecting against plague and ashfall. These trinkets made from everything from herbs to animal bones became a booming trade. Vendors promised protection for a small coin, and people clung to these objects as lifelines in an unpredictable world. Skeptics dismissed them, but belief in their power gave some comfort. As the year progresses, political unrest bubbles beneath the surface. Leaders strained by disease and famine face rebellions and power struggles. Some noble factions vie for control over weakened regions, while others retreat behind fortified walls, hoping to wait out the calamities. You imagine the tension in smoky halls where whispers and rumors spread faster than the plague. In contrast to this turmoil, some religious figures gain increased influence by preaching messages of hope, repentance, or apocalypse. The interplay of faith and fear shapes the social fabric profoundly. Pilgrimages to holy sites spike, and relics of saints are believed to hold miraculous healing powers. Whether these beliefs helped or hindered recovery remains part of ongoing scholarly discussion. The natural world continues to respond to humanity's retreat. Forests reclaim abandoned fields, and wildlife flourishes in places once crowded with human activity. Wolves and boars roam closer to settlements, causing new hazards, but also reminding you that nature persists beyond human suffering. There's also evidence that some cultures outside Europe experience similar upheavals, though on different timelines. Climate anomalies affected Asia and Africa, leading to harvest failures and societal stress. This global perspective challenges the Eurocentric view and raises questions about interconnected environmental impacts. As twilight descends, you contemplate the fragile balance between destruction and renewal. The year 541 is a brutal continuation of the disaster cycle plague, famine, climate chaos, but it also sows the seeds of transformation. Societies fracture but also begin to reinvent themselves, laying foundations for new eras. You settle down to rest, the thick ash still muffling distant sounds. The shadow of death remains long, but the faint pulse of life endures. You wonder what tomorrow might bring in this strange, harsh world, knowing that even in the darkest times, the story of humanity goes on. you wake up to a world still breathing heavily from the disasters that began decades ago. The year is roughly 540 something, and you somehow have survived the worst of it, but barely. The Justinian plague continues its merciless waves like a relentless tide, washing over Europe, Asia, and Africa. You trudge through streets heavy with loss, their silence punctuated only by the occasional cough or wheeze from those unlucky enough to be sick. The plague caused by Yersinia pestis is the same bacterium that would centuries later cause the Black Death, but this one, it was a shock of historic proportions in its own right. Experts estimate that during its first wave alone, the plague wiped out up to 25 to 50 million people, an appalling toll in a world with far fewer humans than today. Imagine the fear that hung in the air heavier than the ash that had fallen years earlier. You might find it curious, albeit morbidly, that some communities attempted to quarantine themselves with primitive isolation practices. Some cities closed their gates, some families locked themselves away. But without understanding the mechanisms of disease transmission, these measures were more hopeful than effective. Here's a quirky tidbit: some medieval doctors believed the plague was caused by bad air or miasma, which led them to wear masks stuffed with herbs or to carry sweet-smelling flowers to ward off the foul breath of death. Picture a plague doctor shuffling along with a beaked mask full of lavender and rose petals, looking like a bizarre bird of ill omen. Historians still argue whether the Justinian plague fundamentally changed the course of Western civilization, or simply accelerated existing trends of political and social decline. Some argue that the massive population loss weakened empires beyond recovery. Others say these states were already fragile and the plague merely nudged them over the edge. Meanwhile, the volcanic eruption that darkened the skies in 536 has faded from memory for most, but its effects linger in ways more subtle and insidious. The resulting volcanic winter led to decades of colder than normal temperatures, poor harvests, and famine. Tree rings from Europe and Asia tell the story of these tough years, revealing stunted growth and the echoes of crop failures. You might be amused to know that some people blamed celestial phenomena for the hard times. Comets and eclipses were read as divine warnings, inspiring both awe and terror. Some went so far as to interpret these signs as the end of the world approaching, sparking apocalyptic fervor that gripped communities in its icy grip. Religious leaders responded in kind, preaching repentance and sometimes harsher measures. The Christian Church in particular found its role transformed as it became the caretaker of not just souls but entire communities ravaged by disease and death. Pilgrimages to holy sites surged as people desperately sought divine intervention. Yet life trudged on, despite it all. You might find it ironic that art and literature from this period occasionally reflect these turbulent times, not just in somber religious themes, but sometimes in surprisingly dark humor. After all, what better way to cope than a little gallows humor? Trade routes that had faltered during the crisis slowly reopened, but the economic landscape was forever altered. Some cities never recovered, while others adapted by shifting to different industries or reinventing themselves. This flexibility would prove critical in the centuries to come. One fringe theory suggests that the plague might have contributed to the collapse of entire regions by reducing the labor force so dramatically that feudal systems began to break down. While this is debated, it points to the profound ripple effects a pandemic can have beyond the immediate death toll. You wander through a landscape forever changed by invisible enemies, ash-filled skies, and a global ecosystem teetering on the edge. The scars of 536 and the plague years are everywhere in the emptiness of once thriving fields and the skeletal remains uncovered by later generations and in the very psyche of humanity. In the end, what's striking is not just the scale of destruction, but the stubborn tenacity of those who lived through it. Even amid famine, fear, and death, people clung to hope, rebuilt communities, and passed down stories to remind us all of our resilience. You find yourself wandering the worn cobblestone streets of Constantinople, a city that still wears the scars of turmoil like a battle-hardened veteran. The air feels heavy, as if carrying the collective memory of loss, plague, famine, and failed empires. The year is now deep into the 6th century, well past that infamous year 536, yet the world you know is still grappling with the cataclysms that began back then. The Justinian plague continues to ripple through the population like a grim tide, sometimes swelling, sometimes receding, but never fully gone. You pause noticing the market stalls that once overflowed with vibrant goods now display only meager offerings. Merchants whisper of shortages, and traders tread lightly on the gravel paths, cautious of both disease and bandits. The plague, that ruthless killer you've come to dread, remains an ever-present shadow, originating from fleas hitching rides on black rats creatures you suspect would win the Most Unwanted Animal Award any day. It has shredded the fabric of society in ways far beyond just the horrifying death count. Here's a fact you might find chilling during this plague's waves: as much as a quarter or even half of Constantinople's population perished. Imagine a city losing up to 100,000 people or more, not in one blow, but over several terrifying waves. Streets that used to bustle with life turned eerily quiet, homes abandoned, and families torn apart. You probably wouldn't last a day here without a strong stomach and some serious luck. Now for a quirky twist. Medieval people had all sorts of ideas about what caused this mysterious disease. Without germ theory, they resorted to explanations ranging from angry gods to miasma, that is poisonous air. Plague doctors, those iconic figures wearing long-beaked masks, filled with aromatic herbs, were the medieval version of hazmat suits. Designed not out of scientific knowledge, but desperate guesswork. You can't help but imagine how odd they must have looked, a cross between a crow and a medieval apothecary shuffling through dark alleys. Historians still argue whether the plague's impact on the Byzantine Empire was a nail in its coffin, or just another obstacle in its long, slow decline. Some say it accelerated the fragmentation of the empire's hold over its territories. Others suggest the empire was already unraveling under the weight of political strife and constant warfare, and the plague simply hastened an inevitable outcome. Whatever the case, the empire that once held the Mediterranean in its grasp was a shadow of its former self. While the plague ravaged human populations, the environment was playing its own strange part in this saga. Remember those volcanic eruptions that darkened skies and brought on a volcanic winter starting in 536. Their effects lingered in ways subtle yet profound. Decades of cooler temperatures meant shorter growing seasons and frequent crop failures. You'd think people would have started to recognize a pattern, but without modern climate science, each famine was just another cruel twist of fate. What's wild is how these environmental hardships forced communities into survival mode. Famine isn't just hunger, it's social upheaval, a breeding ground for unrest and a cruel equalizer that respects neither status nor wealth. Some regions saw peasant uprisings, while in others the wealthy hoarded food or abandoned their lands, leaving the countryside to decay. Cities starved of food supplies became battlegrounds not just for armies, but for everyday survival. Here's a fringe fact for you. Some scholars suggest that this period's widespread suffering may have inadvertently spurred technological and agricultural innovations. For example, the introduction or spread of crop rotation methods and the increased use of hardier grains might have been early attempts to cope with unreliable harvests. Of course, these changes took time and weren't immediate fixes, but They hint at humanity's stubborn adaptability. Meanwhile, you notice the cultural landscape shifting as well. The once bright and expansive Roman traditions are folding under pressure, and new, more localized customs are taking root. The Christian church, already a dominant force, steps further into the breach, becoming a social safety net and a beacon of hope. Monasteries multiply, acting as both spiritual centers and repositories of knowledge. Their scribes diligently copy texts, preserving wisdom that might otherwise have vanished amidst the chaos. You might chuckle at the contrast while society suffers monks' labor away in their dimly lit rooms, meticulously writing manuscripts by candlelight. Because nothing says hope like a bunch of people obsessed with dusty old books in a plague-ridden world. Historians still debate how much the plague and climate crisis directly shaped the Middle Ages' social and economic systems. Did these catastrophes help erode the rigid structures of late antiquity, paving the way for medieval feudalism? Or were these systems already in place with the disasters just intensifying existing trends? The jury's still out, but it's clear the world was not the same afterward. Now let's dive into something a bit more unusual. Some fringe researchers have proposed that the volcanic eruptions and subsequent climate changes may have triggered mass migrations, forcing tribes and groups to move into new territories. These movements might have inflamed conflicts or altered political landscapes, possibly sowing the seeds for future ethnic and territorial disputes. You walking through a rural village outside Constantinople see firsthand how traditional pagan beliefs linger, despite Christianity's spread. Folk healers combine prayers with charms and herbs, blending ancient wisdom with new faith. In such desperate times, you're not picky about who might save you divine intervention magic or just plain luck. Trade, too, is a patchwork of recovery and decline. The famous Silk Road, though, disrupted still functions in parts, bringing exotic goods and ideas. Merchants are cautious, yes, but the demand for luxuries never entirely vanishes, even during plagues and famine. People will always find reasons to buy a bit of beauty or comfort amid the bleakness. Here's a slightly odd historical tidbit. Some records mention merchants using health passports of sorts letters, claiming they came from plague-free zones to reassure buyers. A primitive version of what we'd call quarantine documents today. It seems some form of disease control was instinctively recognized even if the science was absent. Political factions within the empire and beyond scramble to consolidate power amid the turmoil. Fortresses are reinforced alliances forged and broken. The old Roman bureaucratic machinery groans under pressure, and local leaders gain influence as central authority weakens. You pause to reflect on the human cost. Whole generations lost, families broken, societies reconfigured. Yet there's a glimmer of resilience. People rebuild homes, cultivate fields anew, and adapt their lives to this harsher reality. The scars of 536 and the plague years reach beyond statistics. They live in stories, legends, and collective memory. They echo in the rituals people adopt to keep evil at bay, and in the cautious optimism that the sun will shine again. As night falls, you imagine the weary souls who look up at the same starry sky, hoping for brighter days. You might not survive a week in this world of disease and despair, but the people who did well, they laid the groundwork for a future that centuries later would flourish again. You let yourself be carried forward by this narrative, a quiet witness to an age where darkness reigned but did not consume. You find yourself standing on the cusp of an era, the twilight of one long, dark chapter that began with the catastrophic year 536 and stretched through decades of relentless plague, famine, and social upheaval. It's hard to imagine how people managed to endure so much, yet here you are observing the fragile flicker of hope starting to glow in this battered world. You might be surprised to learn that despite everything, the year 600-ish brought the very first whispers of recovery, subtle but unmistakable. Let's start with something solid. By the dawn of the 7th century, some regions in Europe and the Mediterranean began to see the return of warmer, more stable climates. After decades of volcanic winters and crop failures, the Earth finally seemed ready to breathe easier again. Imagine the relief when growing seasons stretched a little longer, and fields that had lain barren showed signs of life once more. Farmers who had spent years struggling to coax grain from poisoned soil and unpredictable weather began to see hope. But it wasn't just the climate that changed. Societies had shifted fundamentally. The old Roman world, already a crumbling relic by 536, had been thoroughly transformed by the disasters that followed. You see, what we call the Dark Ages aren't really as dark as the name implies, but they are a world apart from the thriving cities and grand empires of antiquity. The patchwork of small kingdoms, local lords, and new power centers began to redefine how people lived, worked, and believed. Here's a quirky fact. Many of the medieval social structures and traditions that we now associate with castles, knights, and feudalism actually began taking shape during these turbulent centuries. The collapse of centralized Roman power meant that local defense, agriculture, and justice became the responsibility of whoever could muster strength, usually local nobles or tribal leaders. You're basically witnessing the blueprint of medieval Europe being sketched out on the ruins of the old world. At the same time, the Christian church grew into a dominant political and cultural force. Remember those monks from the previous section, those patient scribes with the candle-lit desks? Their influence became pivotal. They not only preserved ancient knowledge, but also educated new generations, managed lands, and mediated disputes. For many people, the church was a comforting constant, amid chaos a source of spiritual solace and practical governance. Interestingly, the idea of holy kingship began to take root, where rulers claimed divine sanction for their authority. This mingling of spiritual and political power is something historians still debate intensely. Did the church's rise help stabilize societies by uniting people under shared beliefs? Or did it also create new conflicts and power struggles? The answer is probably both, depending on where and when you look. You might chuckle at how certain superstitions flourished during this time. With disease and disaster still looming in memory, people sought magical protections from amulets to ritual prayers. Some of these folk practices were actually inherited from pre-Christian times, layered with new Christian symbolism. It's like a cultural stew where old fears and new hopes mix together, a bit like a medieval version of the keep calm and carry on mentality. Trade routes which had faltered during the worst of the crises began to reopen slowly. The Mediterranean once again saw ships carrying goods, spices, and ideas between distant ports. This revival of commerce sparked cultural exchanges that helped Europe reconnect with the wider world. The Byzantine Empire, though much diminished, remained a crucial player in this network, as did the expanding Islamic caliphates to the south and east, whose rise, you might recall, began not long after the plague years. Here's an unexpected tidbit. The Arabic world preserved and advanced much of the classical knowledge that had been lost or fragmented in Europe. Their libraries and scholars became vital hubs of science, philosophy, and medicine seeds that would later help fuel Europe's Renaissance. So while Europe was rebuilding, other parts of the world were flourishing in new and exciting ways. On the flip side, political fragmentation continued to define this era. Without a strong centralized power, regions often became battlegrounds for competing rulers. Sometimes it was local warlords. Other times, external forces like migrating tribes or rising empires pushed borders and sparked conflicts. You wandering through this fractured landscape would notice the absence of the sweeping imperial ambitions seen in earlier centuries, replaced instead by more localized immediate concerns. Historians still argue about how much this period set the stage for the later medieval world. Was it a slow, chaotic descent into feudal fragmentation, or a necessary reorganization that allowed new political, social, and cultural systems to emerge? The truth is complex. Like much of history, it resists simple answers. But what's clear is that the world after 536 was both fragile and fertile, a paradox of endings and beginnings. Let's look a bit closer at the human side of things. Life was hard, no doubt, but people found ways to celebrate, mourn, and make meaning. Festivals tied to the agricultural calendar continued even if the harvests were uncertain. Local saints and heroes became focal points for community identity. Art and architecture, though simpler than Roman grandeur, reflected the evolving spirit of the time's think humble churches and rough-hewn stone fortifications rather than marble temples. Here's a curious note: some historians suggest that the trauma of the mid-6th century crises helped shape the medieval mindset itself, a cautious, often fatalistic outlook, balanced by deep faith and resilience. In other words, the hardships you've been tracking didn't just change politics and economies. They transformed how people saw the world and their place in it. You might even say that these years taught people an important lesson in adaptation. The volcanic winters and plagues were cruel reminders of nature's power, but human communities adapted by shifting agricultural practices, reorganizing social structures, and reimagining their cultures. It's a slow and uneven process, sometimes marked by setbacks, but ultimately a testament to survival. And here's the last quirky fact for tonight. Some climate scientists studying tree rings and ice cores believe that the environmental shocks of 536 and the decades that followed were among the worst in the last 2 millennia, possibly rivaling even the Little Ice Age centuries later. This means you're not just hearing about history. You're peering into one of Earth's most profound natural experiments in resilience and change. As the century closes, you feel the world settling into a new rhythm. It's quieter than the Age of Empires, less dazzling, but more intimate and human-scaled. Empires fall, pandemics rage, and yet here you are standing at the dawn of a new era, where new stories, new powers, and new dreams will soon take center stage. So, as you drift off tonight, remember this: the year 536 wasn't just a terrible moment in history. It was the start of a long, complicated journey through darkness and light, chaos and order, despair and hope. You might not have survived the first week back then, but the generations that did laid the foundation for a world you now call home. Wherever you are, I hope tonight brings you rest, comfort, and maybe a curious dream or two. I'll be here with another story for you tomorrow night.